In a world of opulence where dynasties ruled, this bride did not walk down the aisle with anticipation, but with a sentence: to sacrifice her freedom in exchange for her father's life. It was a marriage carved in ice, a transaction written in cold blood. But when the veil was lifted, it wasn't only buried truths that came to light. It was the moment when vengeance ignited, guilt demanded redemption, and a love both bitter and blazing was born.
Before we begin this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below.
My name is Nora Carter. I'm 32 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. They said today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. All I remember is the cold. The chill inside St. Matthew's Church seeped through the lace gloves, crawling up to my wrists like invisible cuffs. The scent of white roses mingled with the ancient wooden aroma, sweet, yet suffocating. The organ played a somber tune, heavy like a prayer for the dead rather than for a beginning. I walked down the aisle between two rows of people. They looked at me as though I were a rare commodity, whispering behind my back, "The business bride. They say she's not even pretty. This wedding's just a deal." Every step was an invisible signature. I wasn't walking toward love. I was exchanging my past for a contract, saving the Carter family's honor at the cost of my freedom. And even knowing I was being sold, I still walked on, because some debts can only be paid with one's heart. Uncle Henry's voice echoed in my mind, cold and sharp as a blade. There are two kinds of women, Nora, the ones who are loved and the ones who are useful. You're not lucky enough to be loved, so be useful. I had been useful all my life. Today, I was doing it one last time. At the end of the aisle stood Ethan Blake, tall, straight-backed, and immaculate, the man of Manhattan who had turned scrap metal into an empire. He was so cold that even the golden light dared not come too close. The glow split his face between light and shadow, as if two men lived within him, one who knew how to love and one who had forgotten. The priest recited the vows. I heard my own voice rise, soft but steady. I do. In that moment, I felt a door inside me close. No sound, only silence, heavy as lead. Then came the lifting of the veil. The thin silk rose and light flooded my face. Ethan looked at me. Real, deep, and longer than necessary. Not because of beauty, but because of the quiet exhaustion in my eyes. There was no fear there, no pleading, only a woman who had endured too much. He froze. His eyes trembled. Something rare for a man like him. Later, he would tell me, lies are cruel, but the silence in your eyes was the real tragedy. At that moment, all I felt was his hand trembling slightly as he slid the ring onto my finger. That tremor, small, real, and fleeting, was the only thing I could still believe in during that hollow ceremony. Applause echoed, flashes burst. We turned for the photographer, my smile fixed like a mask. Ethan leaned close, his voice rough and real enough to tear through the act. They lied to me. 4 words. Like a stone dropped onto frozen water, cracking a surface I thought long dead. I didn't look at him. I answered with silence. There was no need to ask. Who lied to whom? We both already knew. The reception that followed was a dazzling stage. Wine, blessings, lights, and false faces. I stood beside him, a display piece in Ethan Blake's collection of triumphs. Every handshake was a deal, every smile a full stop to whatever humanity was left in me. Through the crowd, I noticed a middle-aged woman standing quietly by the wall, her eyes kind. As I passed, she murmured, "I'm Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Blake's housekeeper. Would you like to rest? There's a warmer room upstairs." Her voice was warm, real, like water trickling through my palms. I nodded. Perhaps that was the only sentence all day that made me feel I still existed. Night fell. The car took us back to his penthouse on the Upper East Side. The city receded behind us, its lights stretching out like elongated memories. In the car, he spoke on the phone. His voice was low, curt, cold. "It's done. The deal's secure." A pause, then softer, as if to himself. "But I can't look at her without feeling the guilt of having bought a life." I looked at my reflection in the window. A beautiful, perfect, hollow bride. I wasn't angry. I only thought, at least he knows he bought me. When the car stopped, the city lights reflected on the tall glass tower like a frozen mirror. Ethan opened the door and offered his hand. I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust him, but because it had been so long since anyone reached out simply to hold, not to control. His hand was warm. The warmth brushed my skin, cracking a thin layer of ice inside me. A small thing, but real. The penthouse was bright, vast and silent, like a gallery. No human warmth, no living scent. I stood in the middle, hearing my footsteps echo. Outside, the city roared. Inside, only two souls pretending to be calm remained. Ethan loosened his tie and sighed, voice weary. "I didn't know about what they said. About you." The words were awkward, misplaced, but honest. I didn't reply. Some wounds don't need sharing, only to be seen. And for the first time, he didn't look away. I walked toward the window. The city light washed over my skin, cold, but clear. I thought of my mother, her frail, trembling hands, still believing I would be happy. I thought of Henry, the man who taught me to bury my feelings until they died. I once believed I'd died with them, but when he whispered they lied to me, I realized my heart was still beating. Faint, but alive. The night deepened. I removed my veil, placed it on the chair, and faced the mirror. The bride staring back at me stood tall, lips sealed, eyes fearless. I knew, from the moment that veil was lifted, neither of us could ever return to who we once were. I turned away, walking toward the soft light in the living room. His voice came from behind, husky, like a half-forgotten vow. "I won't let them hurt you again." I smiled faintly, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to. Maybe every redemption begins with something as small as that. Outside, the city still burned bright. Among millions of windows, one light shone, small, weak, but real. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "I am Nora, the bride behind the veil, and this is the first chapter of the negotiation between pain and salvation." I once thought that after the wedding, the storm would subside, but when the elevator opened and the glass-lined corridor swallowed my footsteps, I knew I had just stepped into a silence with teeth. Ethan's penthouse didn't feel like a home, it was a graph of control. Marble floors shone like a still lake, glass ran from floor to ceiling, leather chairs placed with centimeter precision. Gray, abstract paintings hung in rows, not a millimeter askew. No human scent, no voices. If a house reflects its owner's soul, then his soul was a block of pure ice, clear, beautiful, and untouchable. "Your room is on the right. If you need anything, tell Mrs. Alvarez." He spoke lightly, neatly, polite as if handing over a property. The study door closed so softly I had to strain to hear the latch. I stopped at the long table. A silver frame held a black and white photo, a woman standing before an easel, mouth curved in a gentle smile, eyes both bright and tired. The small engraving below read, "Margaret Blake, 1979-2009. His mother, the smile of someone who once dreamed, then wearied. My room faced the park. Thick curtains, warm lights, sheets flat as a drum. On the desk sat a steaming cup of tea and a handwritten card. "Welcome home, Mrs. Alvarez." The script slanted to the right, even and soft like a light stroke on the shoulder. The door opened softly. A woman in her 60s, silver hair neatly tied, a cream-colored apron. "I'm Mrs. Alvarez," she said, her warm, low voice carrying a hint of South America. "Chamomile tea with honey to warm your throat. There's a lot of glass here. You catch the cold easily." I wrapped my hands around the cup, the heat sliding down my throat, opening a small sliver of light in my chest. "Thank you." She sat on the edge of the chair, neither curious nor appraising. "This house isn't cold," she smiled. "It lacks voices. If you want, take a walk to get used to it." "Ah, don't open the last door at the end of the left corridor." She paused a beat. "Mrs. Margaret's studio. The master hasn't gone in there since she passed." I nodded. She stood and straightened the woven blanket set on the chair. "Marriage," she said, "isn't about perfection. It's about respect. With respect, people can live together." The words fell to the floor like seeds. I didn't yet believe they would sprout, but I kept them. The next afternoon, passing the study, I paused before the half-closed door. Ethan's voice drifted out, hoarse and tired. "Yeah, done. The deal is safe." A brief silence, then he lowered his voice, as if speaking to himself. "But I can't look at her without feeling the guilt of buying a life." The word buying touched me like a glass edge. I stepped back, careful not to let my heel strike the floor. No anger, no tears, just a hollow opening between my ribs. In his equation, I was not a wife. I was a contract wrapped in lace. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of a bed so perfect it wouldn't accept a single wrinkle. Outside, the wind scraped the glass like fingernails. Inside, the quiet bit into my wrist where the ring was squeezing. I set the cup down and inhaled slowly, as if relearning how to use my lungs. The door opened softly. Mrs. Alvarez came in with a thick blanket and a glass of warm milk. "I heard the door," she said. "The wind's turning tonight." I asked softly, "Are you afraid of this house?" She shook her head. "No." "Sad, yes. A house gets sad when the people in it forget to talk to each other." She sat down, her sun-browned hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. "Don't turn yourself into an invoice in someone else's story. You are a person." Her words were light as dust, but in this sterile house, dust is proof of life. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders. My fingers stopped feeling cold. "Thank you," I said, my voice steadier. That evening, I went out to the balcony. Below, Manhattan stretched into a boundless carpet of lights. The sky had no stars, only glass reflecting glass. I wondered, among those millions of lit windows, how many people were warm yet felt as cold as I did. The sliding door opened. Ethan stood on the threshold, hands in his pockets. Tie loosened a notch. "You're not asleep?" "I can't sleep." "Everything? All right?" I looked down at the street. "All right? We both got what we wanted." No irony, just arithmetic. He fell silent. "I know you heard the call." I tilted my head. "I did." He exhaled, his eyes dimming. "I won't apologize for the transaction, but I feel guilty." I replied, "Guilt doesn't change the nature of things. It only proves you can still feel pain." The corner of his mouth trembled, like someone taking the last nail out of a wall. "Maybe," he said. "That's the only place to start." We stood a while longer without speaking. The wind flicked the hem of my wedding dress I hadn't yet changed out of. On the other side of the glass, our reflections overlapped. One man learning to breathe, one woman learning to stand straight. That night, I opened the wardrobe and found an empty drawer. I placed inside the welcome home card and the old handkerchief I'd brought from my mother's house. A very small corner, but mine. I dropped the veil on the chair and thought, if this is a prison, I'll straighten the pillows, open the window, and set a plant. A prison still has sunlight if you allow it. Before turning off the light, Ethan's voice came from the hallway, no louder than a prayer. I won't let them hurt you anymore. No clauses, no term limits. I didn't answer. I put that sentence in the same drawer as the handkerchief, where the smallest things live the longest. At dawn, I walked down the left corridor. The studio door was tightly shut. The lock was darkened, the wood edges worn smooth. A few scratches like history written by fingernails. I didn't turn the knob. I only placed my hand on it, greeting a long-standing sorrow. If one day it opens, it won't be because I forced it, but because the house decided to breathe again. In the kitchen, the kettle sang. Mrs. Alvarez stood with her back to me, the smell of baking spreading out, bleeding into this scentless air like the first flow of blood. She turned around. Have something to eat, dear. If a house wants a soul, it needs warmth. I sat on the high chair, listening to the spoon tap the pot. Suddenly, I thought, it turns out healing doesn't begin with grand promises, but with small sounds. I poured tea and leaned against the counter, watching the surface quiver. I thought of my mother. Thin hands wrapped in the scent of eucalyptus oil. Thought of Henry. Don't be sensitive. People only toy with the easily broken. I had learned silence so well I'd forgotten the sound of my own voice. Here, a cup of tea, a blanket, a sentence, 3 anchors keeping me from drifting. Before leaving the kitchen, I stopped at Margaret's photograph, a smile lit from behind. I whispered, as if promising myself, I won't turn to stone here. I'll hang a painting again, even if only in pencil. The words were small, but they sounded like flipping a switch. I returned to the living room. A window was cracked open another half a hand's width. The wind slipped through, carrying distant car noise and the warm smell of flour. The house was still cold, but no longer scentless. In my chest, my heartbeat was steady, like a small drum relearning its first lesson. To know it is still breathing. I wrote a few lines on a slip of paper, folded it, and put it in the empty drawer. Don't turn yourself into an invoice. Today, respect. I smiled for the first time, not out of politeness, and I reintroduced myself to the house, lightly, as if speaking to the wind. I am Nora. This will be my home, even if it begins with just a small corner. And this is chapter 2 of the negotiation between loneliness and healing. I once thought silence was the safest place. But in Ethan's house, silence felt like a sheet of glass, transparent, reflective, showing everything I tried to hide. 3 days had passed since the wedding. Ethan left early, came home late. Dinner was just me and Mrs. Alvarez, the clink of knives and forks marking time like a metronome for loneliness. I began to grow familiar with the metallic scent of the kitchen, the cold wood of the table, and the distance between 2 empty chairs. Here, people lived close through glances and far apart through silence. That afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez brought in a basket of oranges, setting it on the counter. I heard you like poetry, she said softly, her cloudy eyes still bright. I used to. Now, I'm not sure. What we once loved never truly disappears, dear. It only sleeps in a dark corner, waiting for someone to wake it. Her words made my heart sway for a moment. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled faintly. There isn't a bright enough corner here to wake anything. She just smiled, said nothing more, leaving me with the sweet, aching scent of ripe oranges. That night, as I was reading an old poetry book, I heard a knock. 3 short taps, then silence. I opened the door. Ethan stood there, shirt buttoned to the collar, a small leather box in his hand. Am I disturbing you? That depends on why you're here. He stepped inside, placed the box on the table, his breathing slowing. I wanted to apologize. I gave a slight smile. By buying me another gift? It's not a gift, it's the truth. He pushed the box toward me. Open it. Inside was a book. Old, the spine frayed but carefully kept, a first edition of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I froze. It was the book I'd once mentioned at a meeting almost a year ago, before he even knew my name. I thought no one had remembered. I remember you said Whitman wrote as if he were speaking to his own soul, Ethan said slowly. I thought, maybe you should speak to yours again. I stared at the book. My hands trembled, not from its value but from the feeling of being seen, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Where did you find it? An old library in Brooklyn. It took me 2 days. They said this copy once belonged to a poet's wife. Maybe it should stay with someone who once loved poetry for real. I turned a few pages. On the inside cover, in faint blue ink, was a handwritten note. To those who loved and lost but still dared to feel again. I closed the book. You didn't have to do this. I don't want to be your penance. It's not penance, he said, voice low, almost rough. It's respect. Respect for what? I asked quietly. For whatever keeps you standing after being broken. I don't know who taught you that, but I owe them my gratitude. I was silent. A part of me wanted to cry. Another part, cold, disciplined, warned, don't believe him. He's good at pretending. But for the first time, that voice didn't win. I whispered, why would you respect me when from the beginning you saw me as a tool? Ethan lowered his head, his hand tightening. Because of the way you looked at me in the church, it made me ashamed of myself. I thought I understood everything, but I didn't understand the silence of the wounded. It doesn't scream. It just sees through. I said nothing. The room went utterly still. Outside, rain began to fall, each drop tapping against the glass like fingers drumming on a heart. I moved toward the window, light from the street spilling across my face and reflecting in his eyes. Softly, as if to myself, I said, you don't know how Henry taught me. He never hit me. He just took away everything that made me feel human. He said I was useless, that I only deserved to exist if I was useful. And I believed him. Until I looked in the mirror one day and couldn't recognize who was staring back. Ethan didn't move. The city lights caught the edge of his cheekbone, cold but warmer than before. I'm sorry, he murmured. Don't, I interrupted. I don't need apologies for the past. I just need someone who won't make me disappear again. I turned to him, my eyes both soft and sharp. Don't pity me, Ethan. Look at me. Really look. He nodded slowly, like a man bowing to a truth. I am looking, he said. And I see you. The words were simple, but they caught in my throat. For the first time, I didn't feel like a backdrop to someone else's story. I existed, even if only in his gaze. He stepped closer, not too near. Between us remained a space, but it no longer felt cold. You're right, he whispered. I used you. But now, I want to learn how to stay beside you. I smiled faintly. That won't be easy. I know. But I don't want to save the deal and let everything else die again. What are you afraid of, Ethan? I'm afraid of becoming my father. A man who loved too late and regretted it all his life. The room fell silent. I picked up Leaves of Grass again and turned to the bookmarked page. A line from Whitman stood out, as if sent exactly for this moment. I am large, I contain multitudes. I looked at him. We're all fragments, aren't we? He nodded. The difference is some people hide their fragments. You turn yours into light. I smiled softly. The smile wasn't for him. It was for myself. The girl who once believed she existed only to be useful. Before leaving, Ethan stopped at the doorway. His voice was quiet but certain. I don't know what's ahead, Nora, but from today on, you're not my transaction. The door closed behind him. The rain kept falling, but this time I didn't feel cold. I sat down, reopened the book, and read aloud. I exist as I am. That is enough. The light from the lamp reflected on the glass. In it, I saw the image of a woman, no longer just the bride behind the veil, but a soul learning to return to herself. I placed the book gently on the table and whispered, "If respect is the beginning of love, then perhaps I've just heard its first sound." There are mornings when I wake to sunlight spilling across the stone floor like pale gold strokes. The distant city is still loud, but the penthouse is so quiet I can hear the clock hands tick forward. Ethan leaves early for work, and I usually sit at the kitchen table drinking chamomile tea brewed by Mrs. Alvarez. She doesn't say much, only leaves me with half-joking, half-true lines like, "People are only happy when they stop trying to look strong." I don't dare believe it yet. But ever since Ethan brought me Leaves of Grass, the silence between us has started to change color. It's no longer heavy. It's become a pause that waits. Sometimes he sends brief messages. "Don't forget breakfast." "If you're tired of tea, try some honey." No apologies, no sweetness. And yet, strangely, I feel warm. Perhaps because he's no longer hiding behind a sheet of cold glass. One afternoon, I walked along the upstairs hall. The slanting sunset lit up the old frames. At the end, I stopped before the forbidden door, the studio of Margaret Blake. The lock was old, rusted, and heavy, as if it carried something unresolved inside it. I had no intention of opening it. It's just that, when the last light of day fell across the crack, I found myself wanting to step in. Not out of curiosity, but because of a strange familiarity, as if part of my memory had been hidden in that room. That evening, while Mrs. Alvarez was tidying up, I asked softly, "Have you ever gone into that room?" She paused, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "No. Since the day she died, the master locked it. He said if it's opened, everything will vanish." "Why?" "Because their love never got to say goodbye." She set a small, slightly worn brass key on the table. "I'm not telling you what to do. But sometimes, a key isn't meant for the hand that turns it, but for the heart that's ready." I took it, cold, but real. Night fell, and the city sank into a thin layer of mist. I stood before the door, the key in my hand. When I slid it into the lock, the metal clicked. Small, but it rang inside me like the breath of the past. The door opened. The room was dark, dust thick on every easel. Moonlight poured through the window frame, falling across unfinished canvases. Colors faded, yet still carrying the breath of the one who once touched them. A bottle of red paint was still half dry. A shawl lay draped over a chair, as if Mrs. Margaret might return at any moment. I stepped in slowly. The air held the smell of paint, of oil, of memory. I touched a brush. Dust clung to my fingers and my heart trembled. In that moment, an image of my younger self flashed. Little Nora standing in Henry's sitting room, clutching a cheap watercolor set. He came in, voice dry as paper. "Good children don't waste time on this nonsense." Then he snatched the paints and hurled them at the wall. Red burst like blood, spreading across the tiles. From that day on, I stopped drawing. But here, in this room, the smell of paint mingled with memory, awakening something in me, something Henry thought he'd killed. I sat down, took a charcoal pencil from the table, and sketched a few lines on an old sheet of paper. My hand shook at first, but the more I drew, the steadier it became. Lines emerged. Not beautiful, not complete, but true. I drew a door slightly ajar, light pouring through the crack, my own image. The door behind me clicked open. I started and turned. Ethan stood there. He was silent, eyes moving around the room. Not reproachful, not angry, just quiet. "Why are you here?" "I don't know. I just needed to breathe." He came closer, not too close, Moonlight fell across half his face, the other half in shadow. This room used to be the only place my mother could be herself. When she died, I locked it because I couldn't bear the truth that beauty can die. I lowered my head. But perhaps locking it is what killed it for real. He looked at me, gaze deep but unguarded. I didn't think anyone would dare step in here, not even me. I smiled faintly. Maybe I've died enough times that I'm no longer afraid of ghosts. He moved to the easel and stopped. Moonlight washed over the two of us, turning the room into a living painting. I remember, he said, voice hoarse. My mother once told me, "Son, when you lose the ability to be moved by beauty, that's when you've forgotten how to love." And I did forget. I looked up at Mrs. Margaret's unfinished painting, a petal left incomplete. Maybe she never wanted to be locked away. Maybe she just wanted to be seen one more time. Ethan was quiet. Then he turned to me, speaking slowly, almost a whisper. I locked it. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid I wasn't good enough to protect what's beautiful. My mother. Her. Everyone. I lost them all. I thought I had to be strong, to be cold, to keep things safe. But the colder I became, the more I destroyed. I looked at him. For the first time, I saw a man laid bare in his vulnerability. No longer Ethan Blake of the trading floor. Just a son who had lost his mother and was still finding his way back to who he really was. I set the pencil down and stepped closer. Ethan, I said softly, you can't protect everything, but you can start by not running from it. He nodded. A small smile crossed his face, tired but real. You don't know, he said. From the moment you stepped into this room, it started to smell like life again. We stood in silence. Moonlight stretched across the floor, washing over the unfinished painting. I picked up a brush, touched the last of the red, and finished the final petal. When the stroke was done, the room seemed to breathe. Ethan spoke softly, his voice trembling. I locked it because it hurt too much to look at beauty I couldn't protect. But, seeing you here, maybe I can learn to protect what's real. I turned to him, heart beating slowly. What is real? That which doesn't need to be perfect, only not false. We looked at each other, no smiles, no tears, only a quiet understanding. Between two people full of cracks, that silence was the first healing. I handed him the brush. Paint, I said. I don't know how. That's all right. Just try. He touched the brush to the canvas, drew a thin line. His hand trembled, but his eyes softened. I watched and said quietly, not every wound leaves a scar. Some become art, if we dare to look long enough. Ethan set the brush down. The room filled with the scent of fresh paint. The moonlight had turned whiter. He looked at me, voice barely more than breath. Thank you, Nora. You opened this room. And maybe you opened me too. I smiled. No. I only turned the key. The door wanted to open on its own. We left the studio together. The door closed softly, but this time it wasn't locked. As we walked down the hall, I glanced back. The moonlight still slipped through the crack, falling straight onto the now finished painting. A red petal against the dark, small but alive. I pressed a hand to my chest and whispered, perhaps healing isn't erasing the past but daring to open the door and turn on the light. And that night, for the first time, Ethan's house wasn't cold anymore. It had human warmth. It had moonlight, the smell of paint, and a silence full of life. The city lives by the heartbeat of its lights. Tonight, we are stepping into one of its brightest rooms, the annual gala of the financial elite, where people come not to eat, but to perform. My dress isn't red nor extravagant, just a simple layer of ivory satin, sleek, understated. Mrs. Alvarez suggested the color, saying, "It doesn't shout, but it makes people look closer to see what beauty really is. When she said that, I couldn't help thinking, perhaps she wasn't talking about the dress. Ethan waited for me in the living room. Black suit, matching tie. The light reflected off the folds of his cuff, giving him an air both proud and distant. When I approached, he turned. His gaze lingered for a second, and in that second there was no pity, no remorse, only recognition. "You look beautiful," he said softly. I replied with a half smile. "No need to say what you don't mean. I'm only saying what I see." I looked at him and realized, for the first time, I didn't want to look away. The ballroom at the Waldorf shimmered with crystal light. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the mingled scent of perfume floated like the faint smoke of pretense. I walked beside Ethan, each step measured as if keeping time with a negotiation. All eyes were on him, and on me, the one they whispered about as the contract bride. The familiar murmurs came again. "There she is, Blake's wife. Didn't think he had that kind of taste." I heard it, but it didn't sting anymore. I smiled, lifted my glass of champagne as if their words were only wind. Once I had been burned by the tongues of others. Now I'd learned how to stand in the fire without disappearing. Through the crowd, Richard Sloane appeared. A smile sharp as a blade, eyes smooth as glass. A major shareholder, one who had publicly opposed Ethan's merger. "Mrs. Blake," he said, voice half polite, half probing. "An honor to finally meet the woman who helped seal the deal of the decade." I knew his kind, men who don't fight with weapons, but with words. I smiled, light as mist. "You flatter me. I merely signed where I was told." "Oh, but that signature was worth billions. Mr. Blake surely has an eye for value." His gaze flicked toward Ethan, waiting for a reaction. Ethan said nothing. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on my back. Just enough to say, "I trust her." Sloane raised a brow and turned back to me. "Perhaps you can tell us, Mrs. Blake, between marriage and a business contract, which one yields the higher profit?" The air paused. A few curious glances turned my way, waiting to see how the transaction bride would respond. I set my glass down, looked him straight in the eye, my voice calm. "Both rely on trust, Mr. Sloane. The difference is, contracts end when they're broken. Marriage only fails when respect disappears." Sloane hesitated. I continued, softer but sharper. "The greatest deals aren't made between companies, but between people. And if you don't believe that, perhaps you've been investing in the wrong market." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then a few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Ethan looked at me, not as a man in debt, but as an ally. He gave a small nod, proud, and under the chandelier's light I saw him take half a step back, so I could stand in the light instead. The band began to play a tango, smooth as a blade. Ethan extended his hand. "Dance with me?" I hesitated. I wasn't good at dancing, and he knew it. But there was something in his eyes that made me say yes. The first steps were clumsy. He led. I followed. Our rhythm didn't match. Ethan pressed his lips together. I held my breath. Then he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't try to be perfect. Just let go." I smiled faintly and let my hand slide into his. We moved, slowly, then steadily. The music pulled our bodies closer, not through passion, but through trust. For the first time, I felt I wasn't performing with him, but truly with him. You can fake love, but not trust. When the music stopped, I could still hear my heartbeat. He bowed his head slightly, murmuring, "Thank you for not leaving." I answered, "I didn't stay out of pity, Ethan. I stayed because I wanted to see if the man behind the ice was real." He smiled faintly. "And what did you see?" "I see You're melting. After the dance, I stepped off the floor, standing near the window overlooking the avenue. I felt different. Not because of the dress, but because of how I stood. Straight-backed, calm, leaning on no one. I was no longer the contract bride. I was Nora, the woman who knew her worth, even when the world tried to define it for her. Richard Sloane approached, glass in hand, his tone lower now. Perhaps I misjudged you. Your marriage doesn't look as fake as people say. I smiled, steady. Sometimes the greatest lies are the ones people tell when they believe the rumors. He smirked and turned away. Ethan came to stand beside me, not touching, just sharing the same view of the city. You silenced them, he said. I didn't do anything, I replied. I only told the truth. He smiled faintly. Sometimes telling the truth is the bravest act of all. Below us, the city lights stretched endlessly, and inside me, something glowed too, not bright, but steady. Ethan spoke again, his eyes still on the skyline. You know, when you stood there, you looked so strong. I was afraid I'd hurt you again. I turned to him, a soft smile. Then don't. Just respect me, as you promised. He nodded, silent. We stood together, not shoulder to shoulder, but side by side, both facing the light. And somewhere behind us, I heard Richard Sloane whisper to someone, maybe this marriage isn't fake after all. That night, when we returned home, I slipped off my shoes and stepped barefoot onto the cool wooden floor. Mrs. Alvarez was in the kitchen, making tea. She looked up and smiled gently. You shone tonight. I only stood where the light happened to fall, I said. She poured the tea, voice soft and sure. No, that light came from within you. I was silent. Suddenly, my eyes stung. Perhaps for the first time in my life, I didn't regret staying. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced toward the studio. Moonlight filtered through the crack, falling across Margaret's unfinished painting, the red petals still blooming. I whispered into that silver glow. I've started, Mother. I'm learning to bloom again. Slowly, but truly. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone in that house. I felt alive, not just existing. Some changes don't arrive with a bang, but with a breath. Since the night of the gala, something has shifted between Ethan and me. Not clear, not loud, only that the silences have stopped being cold. He still leaves early and comes home late, but now he walks into the house like a man who has somewhere to return to, not like someone taking shelter in his own apartment. Sometimes I see him stop at the threshold of the studio, just to look at the painting of the red petal I finished. Each time he stands there for a long while, saying nothing. Perhaps he's looking at something I can't see, something inside himself that has begun to come back to life. One evening, the sky broke into rain. Drops beat against the glass like a racing heartbeat. I was sitting and drawing when Ethan walked in without knocking, shirt damp, hair wet, tired, but with a strange brightness in his eyes. Sorry, he said. I need to be here for a bit. I put the brush down. This room is always open. He sat across from me, amid patches of color and the smell of paint, his shoulders as if they'd finally laid something down. Every time I look at that painting, he said, eyes on the red petal, I think of my mother. She used to tell me, no one can love if they're still afraid of being abandoned. I realized, I've spent my whole life loving in fear. I stayed quiet. He went on, his voice growing hoarse. I was afraid of hurting people, so I chose to have no feelings. But that's exactly what made everything I touched turn cold. I asked softly, and now? Now I'm afraid of the opposite, afraid these feelings will be real. I looked at him. Outside, the rain drew lines of light across the window pane. Maybe fear is sometimes a sign of life, I said. The dead don't feel fear. Only those who love are afraid of losing. He looked at me, his eyes gentling, as if he had just found something he'd lost for too long. You always talk like someone who has died and come back. I smiled, half true and half sad. Because I have. Henry made me believe I was invisible. But you, at least you see me? The room was silent. Only the rain fell, soft, steady, like an old song. Ethan spoke slowly. I've never told anyone this, but my mother was depressed. She loved my father with her whole heart, but he didn't know how to love her back. I grew up between two strangers, one silent, one crying every night. I promised myself I would never repeat that. But in the end, I still lived like my father, playing the part of the strong one, when really I was just a child afraid of feeling. He lifted his head and looked at me. What about you, Nora? What are you afraid of? I took a deep breath. The answer wasn't easy. I'm afraid of being seen. Not out of shame, but because I fear that once someone truly sees me, they'll leave. I'm here, he said. I met his eyes and smiled, faintly. Because you haven't seen it all yet. We both laughed. A small, real laugh, light as a breath. That night, he stayed. He didn't say anything more, just listened while I painted. I could feel his gaze following each brush stroke, not invasive, just present. Sometimes closeness isn't in touch, but in staying, quietly, without leaving. When the painting was finished, I set the brush down. He asked, "What did you paint?" I painted two figures, one broken, one picking up the pieces. Who's the one picking them up? I don't know yet. Maybe both. He smiled lightly, a real smile, rare to see. I want to learn to paint. I won't be good, but I want to understand what makes you feel at peace. You don't have to be good, I said. Just be honest. I handed him the brush. He took it, awkwardly. A drop of paint fell onto the canvas and bled into a long streak. I laughed. You've just made what people call beautiful unconsciousness. Or just clumsiness. Sometimes those two are the same. He looked at me, his gaze softened, the look of someone who has stopped pretending. I've been pretending for too long, Nora. Pretending to be strong, pretending to be composed, pretending I didn't need love. But now, he stopped and drew a deep breath. Now I don't want to pretend anymore. The air between us slowed, thickened. I could hear my own heart, each beat strangely clear. What do you want? I asked. The truth, even if it might hurt. I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving his. Everything outside, the lights, the rain, the wind, blurred away. Only he and I remained, in a room that still smelled of paint. He bent his head and said softly, I don't know if this is right. I whispered, if it makes you feel alive, it doesn't have to be right. And he kissed me. Not hurried, not fierce, only slowly, like a confession. The kiss of someone who has passed through hurt and found trust again. It wasn't the beginning of sex, but of faith. I didn't resist. I closed my eyes and let myself dissolve into that deeply human feeling, warm, fragile, so real it made me want to cry. When he drew back, our foreheads still touched. He murmured like a prayer. Thank you. Not for forgiving me, but for letting me be real. I touched his face and answered softly, don't thank me. Thank yourself. For daring to be afraid. After that night, we didn't speak of it. But the distance between two people in that house changed its name. It was no longer separation, but space to breathe. Ethan started coming home earlier. He ate with me, listened to Mrs. Alvarez tell old stories, and sometimes smiled, lightly, as if he'd forgotten how for a long time. The studio was no longer locked. The penthouse smelled of paint, of tea, and of life. One morning, he said, "If one day you want to leave, I won't stop you. But I hope that when that day comes, you'll know you were loved, not out of pity, not as a transaction, but because you are you." I looked at him and nodded gently. "And you, if one day you're no longer afraid, don't forget that this very fear taught you how to love." That night, before going to sleep, I stood on the balcony. The sky was clear. No rain. The city below burned bright, but it no longer felt distant. I touched my lips, where the warmth of that kiss still lingered, and I realized every true deliverance begins when we dare to believe the thing we once doubted most. I wrote a single line in my journal, for no one else to read. Tonight, I am no longer the contract bride. I am a woman who has just learned how to trust. And when I turned out the light, the house breathed with me, slow, true, and at peace. I always thought darkness was just a closed chapter of the past until it found its way back, standing right at my doorstep. That morning, the city was cold, gray clouds pressing low over the buildings. I was making tea for Mrs. Alvarez when the doorbell rang, sharp, deliberate, like a familiar knock from an old nightmare. Mrs. Alvarez went to answer it, then turned back, her eyes uneasy. "Nora," she said softly, "someone's here to see you." Even before I stepped out, the scent of cologne told me who it was. Henry Carter stood there, impeccably dressed, though his suit was creased, his shoes polished to a shine that only emphasized the rot beneath the surface. His eyes hadn't changed, a mix of power, contempt, and the faint thrill of knowing he could still make someone tremble. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice dragging out the words. "Married to Ethan Blake, from debtor to duchess in one move. I must say, Nora, I'm impressed." I stood tall. "What do you want, Henry?" "Just a small visit," he replied with a smirk, "and a reminder." He sat down as if he still owned the place. "I need a favor. 2 million. Not much for Blake, but enough to keep certain old matters from reaching the press." I laughed, a dry sound that cracked against the cold floor. "What matters, Henry? That you made me sign away my parents' estate? Or that you forced me to take the blame so you could keep your reputation? Which one are you selling this time?" He raised an eyebrow, voice dropping low. "Don't be clever. I still have documents, contracts, letters, transactions between my company and your family. One headline, and you'll be right back where you started. The tragic daughter of the Carter name." I looked at him, studying every wrinkle of arrogance. Once, that look was enough to make me bow my head. Not anymore. I'd walked too far to turn back. "You know what, Henry?" I said quietly. "You can only scare someone who's still afraid. And I'm not." He barked out a laugh, ugly and hollow. "Really? Let's test that. You think Blake will keep you once he learns everything was a deal? Men like him only love victory, not the ones who lose with them." That voice sliced through my memory. It used to be the chain that kept me small, taught me that gratitude meant silence. Now it only made me feel pity. "Ethan doesn't need to save me, Henry," I said evenly. "And you no longer have the power to make me kneel. I once thought you were my fate. Now I see. You were just a lesson." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan appeared, shirt collar open, eyes cold, voice like a blade being sharpened. "What's going on here?" Henry turned, forcing a grin. "Ah, just a private conversation between family." "No need for privacy," Ethan said, his gaze unflinching. "I've heard enough." Henry shrugged, trying for calm. "You're quick, Mr. Blake. I only wanted to ensure some old misunderstandings don't get twisted." "Or perhaps you came to blackmail," Ethan replied, steady as stone. Henry stiffened, grasping for composure. "I have things that could make you rethink this marriage. I placed a hand on Ethan's arm, stopping him. No need. Let me. He turned to me, concern flickering in his eyes. Trust me, I whispered. I faced Henry. You've taken too much from me already. But today I'm reclaiming the last thing you can't touch, my right to define who I am. I pulled a folded paper from my coat and laid it on the table. This is a restraining order, Henry Carter, signed by the Manhattan court this morning. I knew you'd come. He froze, eyes darting to the red seal. You think that piece of paper will stop me? No, I said calmly. I will. He opened his mouth, but Ethan stepped forward. Carter, if you're still here in 1 minute, I'll make sure your name disappears from every deal on Wall Street. He paused, voice dropping like thunder. Nora isn't anyone's tool. She's a free woman, and I'm not here to protect her, but to witness her. Henry looked between us and knew he'd lost. For the first time, he seemed small. Not because of age, but because there was no fear left for him to feed on. He exhaled, turned, and left. The door slammed shut, sharp, final, like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken years to write. When his footsteps faded, I stood still. No trembling, no tears. Just a strange lightness in my chest, the kind that almost makes you fall. Ethan looked at me for a long time. Are you all right? I don't know, I said, breathing out. But I think, for the first time, I feel alive. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. I used to think I was here to protect you. But right now, I'm just proud. You don't need saving anymore. No, I said. But you can walk beside me if you want. I want to. That evening, we sat in the studio. I opened a fresh canvas, the scent of oil paint filling the air. Ethan poured wine and sat nearby, quiet. The golden light cast our shadows across the wall, reflecting Margaret's old painting, the woman who once told her son, "Art is where the soul hides when the world gives it no air to breathe." You know, Ethan said slowly, my mother used to say there are two kinds of people, those who live off the fear of others, and those who live by facing their own. Today, you became the second. I smiled. And you? I'm learning from you. I turned back to the canvas, my hand trembling slightly as I began to paint. I didn't paint Henry. He didn't deserve to exist in art. I painted a woman seen from behind, standing in an open field, hair flying, spine straight. In the distance, the sky was no longer black, but a faint, rising blue. Ethan came closer, silent, watching. Where is she going? He asked. To a place where the wind no longer makes her flinch. He placed a hand on my shoulder, voice gentle. I'll go with you, if you'll have me. I met his gaze, calm. Just don't walk ahead. Don't pull me. Walk beside me. I promise. That night, I stepped onto the balcony. The wind was cold, but different. No longer biting, just brushing against my skin like a greeting from a new world. The city below glowed bright, alive. I leaned on the railing, feeling my breath in the air. Henry was gone, but I knew. Fear never truly dies. It only loses power when we dare to look it in the eye. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line, my hand trembling from the wind. Freedom doesn't come when we run from the past, but when the past no longer decides who we are. I closed the notebook and set down the pen. Behind me, Ethan turned on the light inside the room, the warm glow spilling out onto the balcony. I turned back. His smile met mine, peaceful, unbroken. And I realized we were no longer living to avenge, but learning how to live to be free. People often say that after the storm, the sky clears. But they forget. Sometimes, the quiet after the tempest can be terrifying. Because that's when you're forced to listen to the sound of your own heartbeat. After the day Henry left, Ethan's penthouse felt entirely different. No one changed the furniture, no walls were repainted, yet everything seemed softer. Morning light no longer felt lost on the marble floor. The sound of boiling water, a spoon tapping porcelain, even the creak of the window opening to let the breeze in, all blended together, forming a melody of life. Mrs. Alvarez often joked, "This house finally has a soul, Nora." I smiled every time she said it, but deep down, I knew that soul was growing inside me. That morning, I woke early. Thin sunlight rested on my hands. I sat by the window, sketchbook open. I wasn't drawing people or places, just light. Because for years I hadn't dared to believe I had the right to hold it. Ethan's footsteps echoed behind me. He was still half asleep, his hair a tousled mess, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. "You're up early," he said, voice low and husky, warm like the breath of morning. "I wanted to see the sunrise here," I replied. "I used to think this place would never have real light." He looked out the window, smiled faintly. "Then you made it appear." The words were light, not a compliment, but recognition. Someone who once couldn't see me, now saw me clearly. We sat by the window together. No words, just tea, sunlight, and two people breathing in the same rhythm. When I went downstairs, the scent of baked bread filled the air. Mrs. Alvarez was cutting fruit, and Ethan, for the first time, stood beside her wearing an apron. I froze at the doorway, half amused, half surprised. "What are you doing?" "Making coffee," he said, oddly serious. "It's my turn today." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "No," he admitted, "but I want to learn." He poured the water carefully, but his hand trembled slightly, spilling coffee onto the counter. Mrs. Alvarez chuckled softly, and I shook my head, stepping forward to wipe the spill. "You don't have to be perfect at everything," I said. "I know," he replied, "but I want to do something ordinary." "For who?" I asked quietly. "For you." Just 3 words, yet they carried more than any grand declaration of love. I realized, real love doesn't bloom in grand gestures, but in small, quiet ones, the kind only the sincere ever make. When I tasted the coffee he made, it was bitter, a little burnt. But I still said, "It's good." Ethan looked at me, half doubtful, half believing. "You don't have to be better," I said softly. "Just stay." That afternoon, I decided to hang new paintings in the living room. They weren't masterpieces, just little frames of everyday life. My hands making tea, sunlight filtering through the blinds in the study, or a photo Ethan secretly took of me asleep in the studio. Ordinary moments, but for me, proof that I was living, not merely surviving. Ethan helped me hammer the nails. Each strike echoed like the heartbeat of the house. When we finished, we stepped back to admire the colorful wall. "This house has never felt more like a home," he said. I smiled, "because it bears our fingerprints." Mrs. Alvarez passed by, smiling gently at us. "When a house is lived in, it's different," she said. "You can smell the tea, the paint, and affection." Her words caught in my throat. Affection, a simple word, yet one I'd spent half a lifetime searching for. Night. Ethan and I sat on the balcony. Below, Manhattan glimmered like an upside-down galaxy. I leaned against the railing, wind tugging at my hair. "Ethan," I asked quietly, "if one day you lost everything, money, fame, all of it, would you still be here?" He was silent for a while before answering. "I once had everything and felt empty, but now, with only you, I know what living feels like." I looked at him and saw, in his eyes, no distance left between us. "You know," I said softly, "I used to fear love because it made me dependent. But with you, I don't feel bound." I feel home. He took my hand. I don't want to be the one you lean on. I want to be the one who walks beside you. Then don't walk ahead, I whispered. Just don't leave. I promise. We fell silent. No music, no pretty words. Just two people once broken, learning to trust again. Another morning, I brought a new painting into the studio. Ethan was cleaning his mother's easel, where the red petal still lingered. The mark of the night we opened the door to the past. I placed the new painting beside it. 2 cups of coffee and an open book. He looked at it and asked quietly, "Ours?" "Yes. I think this one doesn't need people in it. Just traces of 2 lives are enough." He was silent for a long moment, then said, "I used to think love had to be bright and burning, but maybe it only needs to shine enough for 2 people to see each other." I smiled. "Yes. And be true enough that there's no need to pretend." He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me from behind, his forehead resting lightly on my shoulder. "I don't know when I started loving you," he whispered. "But I know now. I don't want to learn how to live without you." I turned to him and said, "Don't say love as a promise. Love as a habit. Something you practice every day." He smiled and pressed a kiss to my forehead. That kiss was light as breath, but inside it was everything I had ever missed: tenderness, safety, and respect. That night, before bed, I stepped onto the balcony and wrote in my small notebook, "We didn't begin with love. We began with hurt, and learned how to heal each other. Now every breath, every cup of coffee, every morning is a vow. No roses, no ceremonies, just staying, true and kind." When I closed the notebook, Ethan stood behind me, his hand gently brushing my back. "What are you writing?" "I wrote," I said, "that you've helped me understand. Real love doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be peaceful." He smiled, his eyes soft like the last light of day. "And you," he said, "are that peace." I rested my head on his shoulder. Below, the city still roared, but within us, everything was still. No more transactions. No more fear. Only 2 people, bare, real, and brave enough to choose each other in silence. There are mornings when I still open my eyes in confusion, then need a few beats to believe the past is finally standing outside the door. No more Henry. No more words that hollow the soul. Only light. But light, if it's only enough for myself, is just another form of selfishness. The thought of a place where people like me could breathe came on a gentle afternoon. Sunlight lay across the studio floor like thin ribbons. On the canvas, I had just finished a portrait of a woman whose clear eyes were veined with water cracks down her face. I looked at it for a long time and realized it was me from the old days, dissected by silence. I closed my sketchbook and went to find Ethan. He looked up from a pile of papers. The look in his eyes wasn't that of a CEO, but of a man who had chosen to stay. I told him about the Margaret Foundation, an arts fund named after his mother, a place where women who've lived through mental control, isolation, mockery, and suspicion can touch their voices again through paint, words, clay, through any language an abuser cannot understand. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, as if speaking with a memory. "My mother used to say, 'If you can't make the world fair, at least make it gentler.'" He took my hand. "I believe she'd smile if she saw you." I shook my head. "She'll smile when she sees us." The weeks that followed were a true construction site. Pitch decks, operating plans, partner lists, late-night emails. I read letters from strangers. I've forgotten how to say my own name. I'm afraid if I tell the truth, I'll lose everything. I highlighted each line as if catching breaths that were about to slip away. Ethan sat beside me, typing donor appeals, sketching diagrams with a marker, clumsily making hot cocoa. "I've done a lot of things right," he said, "but not necessarily good." I smiled. Right keeps people safe. Good helps people free. On launch day, Manhattan was rarely so clear. The main hall at Blake Dynamics was simple. White, ash gray, a few olive branches. I stood behind the curtain and felt my heartbeat return to normal. Ethan squeezed my hand. "Don't look for perfect words. Say what's true." When I stepped out and the lights hit, I saw my shadow large on the screen. No veil, only calm eyes. I spoke slowly. "There are wounds that don't bleed. They slip in through rules and silence and tell us we are not enough. I lived there once. But freedom doesn't come from running away. It begins when we choose ourselves again. The Margaret Foundation doesn't tell stories of victims. We tell stories of survivors. If speaking hurts too much, then paint it, shape it, write it. This is where hope begins." The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that supports instead of threatens. Then the applause rose, even, real. Ethan came up after me. He didn't use his business voice. Blake Dynamics was built on numbers, but today, we understand. There's value that can't be measured by profit. The person who taught me that is my wife, Nora. He placed a hand over his chest and looked at me as if to say, just to me, "You saved my small world." That night, he opened wine and played one of Margaret's old jazz records. "I just signed the most important contract of my life," he joked. "Not an M&A. We're rolling out mind and art across the company. Creative rooms, counseling support, recovery leave. From today on, this company invests in people first." I looked at him and saw something warm in the corners of his eyes. "You're giving back what Henry took. Human kindness." He smiled. "I'm only following you, so work can have a soul." From that day on, our home filled with voices. Volunteer artists came through, therapists dropped by, Mrs. Alvarez baked for small group sessions. The studio became a classroom, trembling hands holding brushes, first strokes clumsy but bright. One woman whispered, "I thought I'd gone quiet for good." I placed a brush in her hand. "Silence gets tired too. Try speaking in carmine red." She painted an open doorway, tears falling while her mouth smiled. I understood. The light had arrived in time. One evening, I hung more paintings along the company hallway, untitled, unsigned, just slices of life recalled in color. Employees lingered longer at each piece. Someone murmured, "I see myself here." That was when I knew purpose over profit was no longer a slogan. It had soaked into the pace of footsteps, the tone of morning greetings, even the way people looked at one another. Ethan walked me down the quiet hall. "I used to think my legacy was the company." He stopped before the painting of 2 coffee cups and an open book. "Maybe the real legacy is how we help people soften." I answered, "Our legacy is the people who stand up after hearing this story." Late that night, I opened new emails. Today, I said no for the first time. I hung my drawing on my door. "I'm taking leave to go to therapy. I'm scared, but I'm going." I replied to each one, no platitudes. Only, "You are not invisible. When you're exhausted, lean on us for a while." Before bed, I stepped onto the balcony. The city below glowed like a low-slung Milky Way. The wind threaded my hair and carried the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery. Ethan draped a coat over my shoulders. "What are you thinking?" "That we aren't living just for ourselves anymore." He set a hand over my heart. "And that's a legacy." I wrote in my notebook, "No wound is meaningless if it becomes a source of light. And if anyone asks what true love is, I'll say, 2 people making the world gentler together." I closed the book. Inside, the lights dimmed, but the warmth stayed. The smell of paint, the scent of tea. Laughter allowed to ring loud without apology. The next morning, I returned to the studio. On the haut table lay a handwritten letter with no name. I can't speak in front of a crowd, but I want to paint with you. I've been silent for too long. I set a new bundle of brushes on the edge of the table and placed an empty chair. When the door opened, a woman walked in. Eyes swollen, hands still shaking. I invited her to sit and nudged the tray of colors closer. We'll start with one straight line. Let the light guide the rest. She smiled. A small one. I did too. In the corner, Margaret's photograph hung in a patch of sun as if nodding. I pictured his mother, and all the other mothers, smiling to see their children finally finding a way out of the dark. Not to forget the past, but to redefine it. I turned to the mirror and saw a woman no longer pressed to the frame's edge. I was no longer a contract bride. I was the keeper of keys, opening rooms for souls that need a place to breathe. And as I lifted my brush, I knew. My story had grown beyond me. Legacy was no longer a name etched in stone, but hundreds of heartbeats, a little more at peace. The city began a new morning. I heard heels in the hallway, the kettle's whistle, the papery scent of a fresh ream. I told myself, like a promise I'll make again tomorrow. Today, make the world gentler, even with a single small stroke of color. And when Ethan stepped through the doorway, set down a cup of coffee and smiled at me, I knew purpose had outgrown profit, and our love at last had found a way to stay. There is something strange about peace. It doesn't arrive like happiness does, loud and blazing. It seeps quietly into each breath, into the small movements of ordinary life. A year after the day I walked into St. Matthew's Church, with a white veil and a broken heart, I wore white again. But this time, no one brought me there. I walked on my own. The garden behind the penthouse, where Ethan had planted the first rows of lavender, was wrapped in soft afternoon sunlight. No orchestra, no guests, no photographers. Just me, Ethan, Mrs. Alvarez, and a few women from the Margaret Foundation, the ones whose hands I had once held through the dark. Mrs. Alvarez placed a small bouquet into my hands, woven from wild grass and daisies. "My girl," she said softly, "the first time you came here, it was like you were being put on trial. Today, you come as someone who chose her own fate." I hugged her, feeling the warmth travel all the way to my fingertips. Ethan stood on the other end of the aisle. His eyes no longer held the tension of that first day, only calm, honesty, and the quiet strength of a man who had walked with me through storms, silence, and healing. I began to walk. Each step on the flower-strewn path was a memory, the old insults, the nights of quiet crying, the unfinished paintings, and the morning he made his first cup of coffee. No one escorted me, because I no longer needed to be handed away. When I reached him, the wind stirred, scattering petals into the air. "I didn't think I'd ever want to do this," I said. Ethan smiled, his eyes deep and gentle. "And I never thought I'd deserve to stand here." Mrs. Alvarez gave a knowing nod and stepped back. No priest, no ceremony. Just two people who had walked through hell and learned how to make a vow with their hearts, not needing God to witness it. I spoke first. "Ethan, a year ago, I walked to you not out of love, but out of duty. I sold my freedom to save a name. But today, I come for no one and nothing. Only because I choose to stay. I choose to see you, in your good and in your brokenness, and to love you with the quietest peace inside me. I can't promise I won't be afraid, but I promise not to run when I am. I can't promise I won't be wrong, but I promise to learn with you how to make it right." Ethan bowed his head slightly, then answered, "The first day I saw you, I saw only a veil and a transaction. But when I lifted that veil, I saw the truth. The eyes of someone who had endured too much and still knew how to be gentle. You taught me that love isn't possession. It's respect. I promise never to make you smaller so I can stand taller. I promise that no matter how the world changes, I'll keep choosing you. Not because I need to, but because I want to." We fell silent. Only the sound of wind through the trees and the scent of lavender filled the space between us. I took his hands. They didn't tremble. For the first time. This was a real marriage. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward with 2 slim silver bands. "No diamonds are needed here," she said. "Only hands that know how to hold each other long enough." We exchanged the rings, the cool metal pressed against my skin, but warmth bloomed inside me. I looked at the women from the foundation sitting quietly in the back rows, some crying, some smiling. They had all been silenced once. Today they saw themselves in me, a woman who no longer needed saving. When the small ceremony ended, Ethan held my hand and led me down the flower path. Petals fell like rain, brushing our shoulders, our hair, our skin. He whispered, "You know, on our first wedding day, I made my vow in silence. Today, I make it again, with my real voice." I smiled. "And I vow, not to love you forever, but to love you right." Evening came. We sat in the garden, 2 glasses of wine on the small wooden table. On the table lay a handwritten card from the women at the foundation. "Thank you for helping us believe that gentleness can also be strong." Ethan finished reading and looked at me. "See," he said, "we finally have a legacy. Not houses, not wealth, but souls learning to forgive themselves." I nodded. "And our love," I said, "is proof that pain doesn't destroy us. It just teaches us to love deeper." He was quiet, touching his glass to mine. We drank together. The wine no longer tasted bitter, only softly sweet, like a silent thank you. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, "I once thought marriage was a prison. Now I see it's a mirror, reflecting who we are when we face love and hurt. I don't want to be perfect. I just want to be real." And today, I was. I set the pen down and stepped onto the balcony. Ethan stood there, his back to the city lights. I wrapped my arms around him from behind, feeling his heartbeat sync with mine. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "That we've rewritten the story, and this time, it doesn't need an ending. It just needs to go on." I smiled too, looking out at the night. The wind stirred again. A single petal drifted down, landing at my feet like a whisper. Sometimes love isn't a flame that burns, but a small candle, just enough to keep us from getting lost. We stood there without another word. Amid the noise of the city, beneath a sky scattered with stars, surrounded by lavender and the faint echo of distant music, I knew. This was the true vow. No witnesses needed, no forever required. Just the choice to find each other again, every day, with kindness, with silence, with the small things that make the world softer. And when he bent down to kiss me beneath the rain of petals, I knew. After everything, my life had finally begun in that very moment. There are revenges that need no knives, no venomous words, only the quiet courage to live a gentle, peaceful, and free life enough to make those who once hurt us face the emptiness within themselves. Nora did not win by shouting. She won by walking away in silence, strong, but never cruel. She didn't need to strike back at Henry, because her serenity became the heaviest sentence for anyone who had ever scorned compassion. And Ethan, the man who once used power to mask his pain, learned that the best revenge against the past isn't to forget it, but to live differently from it, to love differently than it taught him, and to mend the world with gentler hands. And I believe, somewhere between the wounds of our own lives, each of us is rewriting a vow not before others, but before the same heart that once broke. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments below. Have you ever chosen healing or revenge for your pain? No grand speech is needed. Just one honest sentence. Because perhaps what you share today might be the small light that helps someone else find their way back to themselves. Sometimes, gentleness is the most beautiful act of defiance.